As you can see, I did a great job of recording the introduction to this video, except that I had the wrong setting on the video camera. My 2000 Jeep XJ had started to struggle to start in the mornings. This was especially noticeable if the Jeep had been standing for a few days. Listen to this video as the Jeep fumbles before it starts. I found that if I turned the ignition on once or twice before I tried to start, there would be no issue and the Jeep would start right up. Now, turning the ignition on without starting allows the fuel pump to run for a few seconds and build pressure. This made me suspect that my fuel pump was busy going out, and based on this assumption I decided to swap out the fuel pump.
Now I'm sure many of you are going to argue that I should just leave the fuel pump until it actually breaks before I replace it. Unfortunately, I'm going to be using this Jeep away from home for the next couple of months, and so I really need it to be as reliable as possible, and if I do break down on the side of the road I'll be absolutely stranded. So I've decided just to go ahead and, as a precautionary measure, change out that fuel pump.
If the fuel system is working correctly, it should be pressurized. So before we do any work, I want to make sure I release any pressure that might be in the line. This here is a fuel rail that feeds the injectors, and the fuel pump feeds the rail through this connector over here. We need to access the Schrader valve that is under this plastic cap. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove this. Now I'm going to take my screwdriver and very gently depress the Schrader valve. What should happen is that the fuel should squirt out. As you can see, there's no pressure on the fuel rail. I know I don't have any other leaks on my fuel system, so this confirms my suspicion that the one-way valve in the fuel pump is not working.
Now, in order to get the fuel pump out, I have to drop the fuel tank over here. And you do that by removing these two bolts, one on each end over here. You've got to undo that nut, screw it down, and then lower your fuel tank out. These are your fuel tank straps over here. Before you can do that, you've got to get in here and undo the connections to the fuel filler over there. So I'm going to start by undoing those two connections, and then I will ease off these nuts over here, allowing the fuel tank to drop. I'm going to put a jack in to support the weight of the fuel tank until I'm able to remove the fuel tank. Right, so I was able to undo this hose clamp, but I just can't reach this one that's inside here. So what I did was to remove the shield from the fuel filler over here, which the rats have made a nest in, so I'll get that cleaned out. But over here I can see the two worm clamps over here, quite easily accessible. So what I'm going to do is undo those two worm clamps over there and then actually pull the hoses out with the tank.
This original Chrysler tag on the pigtail confirms that the 2000 fuel pump is likely factory. We need to disconnect these wires to drop the tank. Find the red tab on the flat side and slide it over to unlock the connector so we can remove it. Now gently pull the connector until it slides out and the plug is loose. To remove the fuel line, push it inward, depress these two white clips simultaneously, and then pull it straight off backwards. This is a two-handed job, which is why we don't have it on camera.
Well, the fuel tank is out. It was not easy at all. Just something to note, I didn't see that this connector here was still connected. There's a little tube that you need to disconnect, so just remember to disconnect that tube. Well, the reason I really struggled was actually these J-bolts over here. You'll see that their nuts are still on. I was unable to get these nuts off. I was able to back this one down, but as you can see over here, the thread is damaged. What has happened, I think, is that the nut has corroded onto the shaft of this bolt, and it would not release. This one over here, I eventually actually had to cut this J-bolt shorter and then just use a socket, a long socket, and simply force this nut, which has damaged this J-bolt. So if you are planning on doing this job, I strongly recommend you have a spare set of J-bolts and possibly even new straps to replace the ones that you take out. Well, the top of the fuel tank was filthy dirty, so I quickly just grabbed the pressure washer and cleaned up this area so that at least it's clean where I'm working. What I got to do next is to get this nut and undo this nut. Now I'm going to go and see if I have a special tool to do that. If not, I'm just going to take my screwdriver and just gently tap each one of these lugs until I can get the nut to rotate, so that I can undo the nut and then remove the fuel pump assembly that's inside of here. So if you take a look at the bottom of the fuel tank over there, you will see a lot of little debris floating around. My biggest concern are those shiny bits, which is actually little pieces of metal. And as this is a plastic tank, the only place that metal can come from is from the fuel pump. So I think we did a wise decision to swap out this fuel pump. Now, to try and get rid of this debris, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little siphon and just try and siphon off all of the bottom of the tank to remove those metal fragments, and that should be enough to get most of it out. Right, so to clean out the tank, what I did is use a siphon to suck out all the fuel that was in there. It was about a gallon into a container. I let that settle, then I poured the top half of that fuel back in again and siphoned it out 3 or 4 times until I was able to get most of the metallic parts out. I then went in there with a cloth and have wiped the whole of the inside of the tank to remove any metallic debris that there might be inside the tank. So the tank is now clean, and I have our new fuel pump over here. So what I'm going to do is now install the new fuel pump assembly back into the tank again. Right, to reinstall the fuel pump assembly, what we're going to do is follow the service manual's recommendation. We are going to clean the threads of both the fuel tank and the threaded ring with soapy water. Once that's done, we're going to put a little bit of water on the seal area over here, and then we will drop the unit in. Now you've got to be very careful. There's an arrow on the unit, and that must face the front of the car, which in this case is that way. So just something to take note of. At the bottom of the fuel pump are these 3 rubber feet. Now I happened to notice when I took the fuel pump out of the bag that one of these, this one over here, was missing this little rubber foot. So just make sure when you take it out the bag that the little rubber foot hasn't fallen out. I just reinstalled it over there, and my understanding of how this assembles is that this will be pressed against the bottom of the tank, so it won't fall out again. But make sure it's there, because you don't want the steel insert pressing against the plastic tank. So just something to note before I put this fuel pump in. Well, you may have noticed that I really struggled to get this nut to engage properly with the fuel tank. So what I eventually did was line up the start of the threads over here and brought the first thread of the nut a little bit backwards. And then using a lot of downwards pressure on the special tool, I was able to push down as I rotated. What happens if you rotate is that this back end tends to lift up, and then the threads don't engage correctly. So it needs downward pressure on both sides before you rotate. That seemed to get it. What I'm going to do next is torque this up, and according to the service manual, this should be torqued to 74 Newton meters or 55 foot-pounds. One thing which we do need to remove from the old fuel pump assembly is this little plastic clip here for the fuel outlet. Now you could also buy a new clip, which might be a good idea if you are planning to do this job. Get yourself a new clip. But what I'm going to have to do is just very gently pull back these 2 tangs over there, and then install that old clip onto this new high pressure fuel outlet over there. Right, so the fuel pump unit has been reinstalled and has been torqued down according to the service manual. I also noticed when I was working on this that these hoses here are very, very degraded. You can see that there's actually a tear starting to happen over there. So I've ordered new hoses, and I'm going to put this project onto hold until the new hoses are here, and then we can start reinstalling the tank. So as I mentioned earlier, while I was busy taking out the fuel tank, there are a couple of things that I've decided to replace. First of all, the two hoses that go to the filler neck, they were extremely dry rotted and were falling apart, so it's probably best that I replace those. And then the two J-bolts over here, the thread on the J-bolts I took out were so damaged that I could not repair them. So I have bought two new J-bolts, and the kit that they came with two new straps. So what I'm going to do is remove the rubber from the old straps and put them onto the new straps, and then I will start reassembling the fuel tank. Right, so I've reinstalled the fuel tank. You can see the filler hose and the breather hose over there with both of those clamps in a position where I can actually reach them. Up at the top there, I've got both of those reinstalled. Now over here, I have connected this plug up. I put a little bit of dielectric grease in there just to make sure that there's no water that can get in there. This connector has been connected up, and this hose has been connected up. So that's all done. And then all of the bolts have been done over here. Now I've done something a little bit different here. It's probably overkill, but I've put up a backup nut to make sure this one doesn't come loose. And then because neither of these are cleave locks, I've put a cleave lock nut over here so that absolutely worst case this whole lot will fall down and my tank doesn't fall out. This is probably overkill, but it's just peace of mind for me. Right, now what I've decided to do is actually bleed the fuel through the system. There's a little bit of air in the hoses that are in the back there. So what I want to do is I want to turn my ignition on and allow the fuel pump to run a few times, and then I'm going to go to the front at the Schrader valve and check if we have fuel pressure yet. So how I'm going to get the fuel pump to run, it automatically primes as you turn the ignition on, and then when it sees that the engine is not running, it's going to shut itself down again. So in order to prime the fuel pump, I'm going to turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off a few times. Right, now just as we did when we went to check if there was fuel pressure on here the first time, I'm going to gently press the Schrader valve, and as you can see this time around, there is actually fuel pressure on the fuel rail. So changing the fuel pump has actually corrected the problem. Well, with the new fuel pump installed, it seems that the engine is running just a little bit smoother than what it was before. It might just be my imagination, but I certainly think she is a fraction smoother. Well, we've used the Jeep a couple of times now and it seems to be working just fine. It starts up really, really easy and there are no other issues with the fuel system. I'm actually very glad that we did finally change out that fuel pump. Those metal shavings at the bottom of the fuel tank were really concerning to me. They shouldn't be there. So I think it was a wise decision to change out that fuel pump. And if anything changes, I will let you guys know.